Autumn 1944. Over the gray skies of occupied Europe, the sirens wailed again. German radar operators tracked the incoming Allied bombers. Familiar patterns, familiar terror. But this time, something was different. From beneath the belly of a B-24 Liberator, a bomb separated. Slowly at first, then suddenly, unnaturally, it accelerated. A streak of white flame burst from its tail. It didn't fall in an arc. It drove itself forward, slicing through the air like a living thing. Down below, German anti-aircraft gunners froze. They had seen falling bombs, tumbling ones, even guided gliders from their own Luftwaffe projects. But never this. The weapon hit its target with surgical precision, detonating with a shock that flattened an entire fuel depot outside Emden. At Peenemünde, engineers studying fragments of the wreckage were speechless. The metallurgy, the fins, the propulsion system, all unfamiliar. One of them whispered, "Die Amerikaner! Sie haben es geschafft!" The Americans, they've done it. What the Germans had just witnessed was the future of warfare. The moment gravity ceased to be a limit, and the sky itself became a weapon. By 1944, the air war over Europe had become an all-consuming storm. Cities were burning, skies were filled with contrails, and the concept of precision seemed almost mythical. Germany's industrial heartland was under relentless bombardment. Yet the Allies still struggled to strike the right targets. Refineries, bridges, shipyards, with accuracy. Despite thousands of sorties, too many bombs missed. Too many crews never came home. The U.S. Army Air Forces had the numbers, the machines, and the courage, but not yet the precision. At the same time, deep inside Germany, another revolution was underway. In secret laboratories at Peenemünde and Mittelwerk, scientists led by Werner von Braun were building weapons that defied imagination. The V-1 buzz bomb, a pilotless flying bomb, and the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, were meant to reverse the tide of war through technology. These were weapons powered by chemistry and mathematics, not manpower. When the first V-2s fell on London, the world entered a new age. The rocket had replaced the rifle as the symbol of terror. American and British intelligence were stunned. If Germany could send a bomb across the channel with no pilot and no warning, what would come next? Allied strategists realized they were fighting not just an enemy army, but an enemy of extraordinary technical imagination. And so, in laboratories from California to Maryland, a quiet race began to create a weapon that could match or surpass the Reich's scientific edge. For the Americans, the answer would not come from vengeance, but from innovation. The U.S. military had already begun experimenting with guided and rocket-propelled munitions, strange hybrids of bomb and missile that blurred the line between dumb ordnance and intelligent weaponry. Their goal was simple, yet radical: control the uncontrollable. As early as 1942, U.S. Navy engineers and Army Air Force scientists began work on smart bombs. The concept was years ahead of its time. Instead of dropping a bomb and letting gravity dictate its path, they imagined attaching small rocket motors and guidance systems, turning a falling object into a flying machine. At first, the results were clumsy. Early tests failed. Rockets misfired. Control surfaces jammed. Gyroscopes spun out of balance. But each failure brought a lesson. The first breakthrough came with a weapon called Azon, short for azimuth only. It wasn't rocket-propelled, but it introduced radio control, a bomb steered in flight by an operator watching from the releasing aircraft. It allowed corrections left or right, guiding the weapon onto bridges and narrow targets that had once been impossible to hit. It was primitive, but it worked. In Burma, in 1944, Azon bombs destroyed key river crossings with unheard-of precision. The next step went further: autonomy. Engineers at the National Bureau of Standards, working with the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, developed the Bat-T, an anti-shipping bomb equipped with a radar seeker and a small rocket assist unit. Unlike Azon, it didn't need human control. It could sense a ship's radar reflection, lock on, and guide itself all the way to impact. It was, in every sense, a guided missile disguised as a bomb. These projects unfolded quietly, in workshops far from the front lines. At Dahlgren, Virginia, and China Lake, California, scientists and military engineers tested prototypes over desert ranges and coastal waters. The Bat-T and its predecessors were odd-looking devices: fins, antennas, glass domes, and wires sprouting from their bodies. Test pilots joked that they looked more like flying fish than bombs. But when the first successful flight occurred, when a rocket-assisted bomb corrected its path mid-air and struck a moving target, the laughter stopped. The Germans had their V weapons. The Americans now had something different: precision. This was not the America of brute force and mass production that the Germans had come to expect. This was an America learning to think like a machine, to apply its industrial genius to subtlety rather than scale. Behind this transformation were men whose names were barely known at the time. Scientists like Dr. Robert F. Wood at the National Defense Research Committee, engineers at Bell Aircraft and McDonnell, and young pilots who risked their lives testing weapons that often failed spectacularly. Many of these men had studied German reports on rocketry and aerodynamics, translated intelligence captured by Allied teams. The irony was undeniable. German innovation had lit the fuse that would soon ignite America's response. As the Allies pushed deeper into France in the summer of 1944, the technological race intensified. Every week brought new intelligence of Germany's rocket projects: the V-2 launch sites, the Me-163 Comet rocket fighter, and rumors of long-range missiles that could strike New York. The Allies responded by accelerating their own secret programs. The rocket-assisted bomb was one of them: smaller, simpler, and faster to produce than the colossal German missiles. It was a weapon born not from ideology, but necessity. By late 1944, test flights of American rocket-boosted bombs were achieving reliable accuracy. Their secret was thrust. Instead of relying on gravity's fixed curve, the rockets provided additional speed and stability, allowing for longer range and flatter trajectories. Some prototypes carried guidance gyros. Others used simple preset controls. A few could be launched from low altitude, their rockets igniting mid-fall, giving them a sudden surge of acceleration that shocked observers. To German radar operators, it looked like the laws of physics had been rewritten. These weapons began to appear in small numbers across theaters of war. In the Pacific, modified bombs with rocket assists were tested against Japanese ships and island fortifications. In Europe, select missions used the new guided ordnance against hardened targets: rail bridges, fuel depots, and submarine pens. The impact was psychological as much as physical. The Luftwaffe's technical divisions, accustomed to seeing the Allies rely on mass bombing, now faced something precise: a kind of surgical strike that hinted at an entirely new dimension of warfare. At Peenemünde, fragments recovered from a strike near the Baltic coast were sent for analysis. The report circulated among German engineers read, "Evidence of propulsion residue indicates foreign rocket propellant. Guidance fins suggest radio or gyroscopic control. No comparable weapon known in our arsenal." To the men who had built the V-2, this was a revelation and a humiliation. They had assumed the Allies were years behind in rocketry. Now they realized that while Germany had chased power, America had pursued precision. By early 1945, the Allies had achieved something unprecedented. They could hit a target with a bomb that thought, a weapon that responded to signals, adjusted its flight, and sought its prey. It was not yet the missile age, but it was the spark that would ignite it. In a war defined by overwhelming force, the rocket-assisted bomb was a whisper of the future, a hint that the next battles would not be fought by armies, but by machines guided by minds. The Germans had stunned the world with their rockets. But before the war was over, America would return the shock. Not with terror weapons, but with precision weapons. The age of the rocket had begun. The story of America's rocket-assisted bombs was not simply about machines. It was about people. The visionaries, engineers, and pilots who dared to believe that accuracy could triumph over terror. In the chaos of total war, they built something that seemed almost impossible. A weapon that could think. The human angle. At the heart of this transformation were the minds that bridged imagination and metal. Many were young engineers barely out of university, physicists, mathematicians, and aeronautical pioneers drawn into the whirlwind of wartime innovation. They worked in isolated desert bases, on wind-swept naval ranges, and in converted factories humming with secrecy. Some had never seen combat, yet their inventions would change it forever. At the Naval Aircraft Modification Unit in Pennsylvania, teams of technicians labored through the night modifying bombs with strange attachments, gyroscopes, miniature radio receivers, and small solid-fuel rocket boosters. A test pilot named Lieutenant Commander Delbert Black recalled watching the first prototype ignite beneath a bomber. It didn't fall. It came alive. For a moment, we forgot it was a bomb. These men and women were driven not by glory, but by obsession. Every successful drop was preceded by dozens of failures. Bombs exploded prematurely, spun out of control, or missed their targets by miles. But in those failures lay learning, each data point pushing the boundary of what was possible. For many, the war was not fought with rifles and trenches, but with equations and experiments. They were inspired, in part, by fear. Reports of Germany's V-2 strikes on London had shaken Allied morale. If the Germans could send supersonic missiles into cities, what could they do next? American scientists felt an unspoken challenge, to respond not with terror, but with mastery. As one engineer wrote in his diary, "If they use the sky to kill, then we must use it to aim." The motivation behind rocket-assisted bombs was brutally practical. By 1943, the Allies had learned that traditional bombing, even with thousands of planes, could not guarantee destruction of hardened or moving targets. Weather, altitude, and human error all conspired against precision. The U.S. Army Air Forces had dropped millions of tons of ordnance. Yet critical targets like ball-bearing plants, bridges, and submarine pens continued to function. Something had to change. The idea was simple. If gravity could not deliver accuracy, then thrust could. By attaching small rocket motors to bombs, engineers could extend range, stabilize flight, and correct trajectories mid-air. In the Pacific, this concept was even more critical. Japanese ships and coastal batteries required quick, precise strikes. Pilots flying at low altitude had little margin for error. A rocket-assisted bomb gave them reach without exposure. Tests at Eglin Field and China Lake proved the concept. Modified 1,000-pound bombs equipped with tail-mounted rockets demonstrated flatter trajectories and tighter impact zones. A few experimental models even incorporated simple sensors that adjusted fins in response to radar or radio signals. It was rudimentary, but revolutionary. The tactical implications were profound. For the first time, bombers could engage specific ships or bridges without carpet bombing entire regions. Commanders began to imagine a new kind of air war, one fought with precision, not saturation. Rocket-assisted bombs were the intersection of two revolutions, propulsion and control. Their design required mastery of both. In propulsion, engineers adapted the same solid-fuel technology being developed for experimental aircraft boosters. The challenge was stability. A bomb falling at hundreds of miles per hour required a perfectly balanced thrust. Too much, and it tumbled out of control. Too little, and it lost the intended advantage. Through trial and error, American researchers learned to calibrate rocket thrust to sustain forward momentum without compromising aerodynamics. In control systems, the innovations were even more remarkable. Some bombs, like the semi-guided GB series, glide bombs, featured preset autopilots that adjusted course during descent. Others, such as the radar-homing Batee, employed an active seeker head that detected the reflection of ships on the sea. This was the first time an airborne weapon could see its target. Every component represented a small miracle of wartime engineering. Miniature gyros, vacuum tubes hardened against vibration, electric servos that could move control surfaces in real time. What had begun as an experiment in guidance soon evolved into the blueprint for the modern cruise missile. To the scientists involved, it felt like glimpsing the future. One researcher at the National Bureau of Standards wrote in awe, "We have created the first weapon that listens, thinks, and strikes." When fragments of these new American bombs began to appear on German soil in late 1944, the reaction among the Reich's engineers was disbelief. In laboratories at Peenemünde, specialists in aerodynamics and propulsion examined pieces of alloy and wiring from the wreckage of a radar-guided glide bomb recovered near the Baltic coast. The construction was alien. Lightweight aluminum honeycomb, precision gyroscopes, vacuum tubes encased in resin, and traces of solid propellant residue. One of von Braun's colleagues, engineer Walter Riedel, wrote in a technical note, "This design demonstrates a remarkable understanding of stabilization and signal guidance. Their methods differ from ours, simpler but effective." For years, the Germans had assumed technological superiority. They had invented the jet fighter, the pulse jet, and the ballistic rocket. Yet here was proof that the Allies, particularly the Americans, were catching up, and in some ways, surpassing them. The difference was philosophical. German design emphasized perfection and power, massive rockets, complex engines, and intricate control systems. American engineers favored adaptability and mass production, good enough to build fast, deploy widely, and improve with every iteration. Where Germany built masterpieces, America built miracles of practicality. To Luftwaffe officers accustomed to crude Allied saturation bombing, the first sightings of these guided or rocket-boosted munitions were terrifying. Reports from frontline units described bombs that seemed to chase targets. One German officer wrote, "It was as if the bombs had eyes." Behind every innovation was leadership willing to defy convention. The U.S. military command, though initially skeptical of gadget warfare, gradually recognized that precision was not luxury, it was survival. Leaders like Admiral Blandy of the E-Reich, U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, and General Henry Happ Arnold of the Army Air Forces became advocates for advanced munitions. They saw in these experiments the seeds of something transformative. Weapons that could deliver maximum effect with minimum waste. Patience was essential. Many within the military establishment dismissed guided bombs as impractical. Yet Arnold insisted, "The bomber will always get through, but it must learn to think." Under his direction, funding for guided and rocket-assisted ordnance continued even during failures. He believed, rightly, that mastery of guidance would shape not just this war, but everyone to follow. This faith culminated in the deployment of the Batee, the Navy's radar-homing glide bomb, in 1945. It became the world's first fully automatic, target-seeking weapon used in combat. Its rocket assist launch gave it the range and speed to strike ships from miles away. For all its brilliance, the rocket-assisted bomb raised uncomfortable questions. Technology had given humanity control over destruction on an unprecedented scale. The separation between the man who dropped a bomb and the man who died beneath it grew wider than ever. Pilots no longer saw their targets through gun sights. They saw them as dots on screens. Scientists spoke in data, not death. One Navy test engineer later confessed, It was exhilarating and horrifying at once. We were teaching machines to kill with precision. Even the German scientists, witnessing their own V-weapons raining destruction on London, struggled with similar guilt. Von Braun famously told an interrogator after the war, "My rockets worked perfectly, only they landed on the wrong planet." The Americans, by contrast, tried to justify their precision as mercy. Fewer bombs, fewer civilians, fewer wasted lives. Yet every advance brought a deeper unease. Each improvement in accuracy made killing easier to justify. In the end, both sides had unleashed something they could no longer fully control. A new kind of warfare, where speed, precision, and automation replaced proximity. Courage and chance. By 1945, the skies over Europe and the Pacific had become laboratories of the future. Bombs no longer fell helplessly. They chose their targets. And in that choice lay both genius and tragedy. For the German engineers who examined the wreckage of America's rocket-assisted bombs, it was a revelation, not of defeat, but of the dawning realization that they were witnessing the next age of war. The future would no longer belong to armies or air fleets, but to ideas. Ideas that moved faster than the speed of sound, guided by invisible hands of calculation and control. And in that revelation, in the stunned silence of German scientists studying the remains of America's innovation, lay the turning point of modern warfare. Spring, 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final act. Allied bombers dominated the skies, and the Reich that once dreamed of 1,000 years was collapsing beneath their shadow. Yet amid that destruction, something new, something extraordinary, was taking shape. The first combat deployment of America's rocket-assisted and guided bombs was not heralded with fanfare. There were no parades, no grand declarations. It happened quietly, over gray seas and broken cities, witnessed only by those who understood what they were seeing. The U.S. Navy's BAT glide bomb, a sleek, winged device with a radar-seeking nose and rocket-assisted drop system, made its debut over the Pacific in early 1945. The target, Japanese shipping lanes off Borneo. From the bomb bay of a PB-4Y2 privateer, a strange metallic shape detached and glided outward. Its small rocket motor ignited, hurling it forward with unnatural grace. Inside its streamlined nose, a radar seeker locked onto the reflection of a ship below. There was no pilot, no hand guiding it, only mathematics and signal echoes. Observers described it as eerie. The bomb seemed to hunt. Minutes later, the weapon struck the side of a Japanese destroyer, splitting it in half. The ocean swallowed the wreck within minutes. The crews on the bomber's deck fell silent. They had just watched the birth of something entirely new, a weapon that found its own path. At first, even American commanders struggled to comprehend the implications. For years, the air war had been fought with brute force, tonnage, altitude, and courage. But this was surgical. A single aircraft, a single weapon, and a single hit could achieve what hundreds of bombers once required. The implications reached far beyond the battlefield. Word spread quietly through intelligence channels. At the same time, in Europe, other variants of rocket-assisted bombs were being tested against hardened German positions. These included early glide bomb models with small booster rockets to extend range and improve stability. Used in limited strikes, they targeted bridges, tunnels, and railway yards, locations that conventional bombers had failed to destroy. In late 1944 and early 1945, U.S. Army Air Force reports described the success of such missions. One bomb, properly guided, equals a squadron's effort. That single line captured the transformation unfolding in the skies. The Germans, however, were not ignorant of what was happening. Their radar operators began to record unusual trajectories. bombs that did not descend in predictable arcs, but accelerated mid-air or curved toward their targets. Luftwaffe analysts initially suspected malfunctioning flak fuses or Allied use of radio decoys. But as reports accumulated, the truth grew harder to dismiss. In one instance, a German radar station near Wilhelmshaven tracked a formation of B-24 Liberators. Moments after bomb release, several echoes detached from the main group, flying erratically before stabilizing, as if adjusting course. Seconds later, the port's oil storage tanks erupted in fire. Recovered debris shocked the engineers at Peenemünde. The fragments contained traces of rocket fuel residue and small actuator mechanisms, technology eerily similar to their own experimental glide bombs, yet executed differently. Simpler, faster to produce, more practical. The realization stung. Germany had pioneered rocketry, but it was America that had turned it into a functional battlefield tool. For the men of the Luftwaffe's Technical Intelligence Corps, it was a humbling experience. In one captured report from April 1945, German officers wrote, "Enemy ordnance recovered near Bremen exhibits propulsion traces consistent with solid fuel acceleration. Control fins appear mechanically stabilized, possibly guided by signal or gyroscopic mechanism. The design shows exceptional ingenuity. Production simplicity suggests rapid scaling potential." Conclusion: American Air Forces have achieved autonomous flight guidance. That phrase, autonomous flight guidance, would haunt German engineers for decades. To the German scientific elite, it was as though the Allies had skipped a chapter of evolution. The Reich's scientists had focused on the monumental, the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet, the massive A-9, A-10 intercontinental missile concepts. But these marvels, though technologically superior, were slow to build and expensive to deploy. America's approach was elegant in its simplicity, a fusion of industry and imagination. By mid-1945, both the BAT and its successors had been used successfully in combat. Navy records later revealed over 50 operational launches, with multiple confirmed hits on enemy vessels. Some missions were aborted due to weather or equipment failure. But the message was clear. The age of the rocket-powered, radar-guided weapon had arrived. In one dramatic engagement over the South China Sea, a Japanese convoy attempting to flee Singapore came under attack. Allied bombers released their new weapons from high altitude. Witnesses aboard escort ships later described bombs that fell, then accelerated horizontally. Within seconds, 2 ships were aflame. The Japanese Navy, already reeling from years of air attack, could not comprehend what had struck them. While Japan bore the brunt of these final demonstrations, news of America's innovation reached Europe through intelligence leaks and captured reports. When German engineers at Nordhausen and Peenemünde read the translated documents, they were speechless. "The Americans have combined rocket and radar," one of them said softly. "They are building the next war while we are losing this one." The irony was sharp. Germany's V-2 rockets, launched in vengeance at London and Antwerp, had terrified millions but achieved little strategic effect. Each missile was an engineering masterpiece and a logistical nightmare. Thousands of slave laborers died constructing them. In contrast, America's rocket-assisted bombs were inexpensive, efficient, and accurate. One of the last Peenemünde engineers to review captured fragments, a propulsion specialist named Karl Heinl, later told Allied interrogators, "We never imagined they could make such progress so quickly. Our entire philosophy was built on the rocket as an end in itself. They made it a means." Even as the Reich collapsed, German technical officers tried desperately to catch up. They proposed a last-ditch program called Feuerball, a crude attempt to combine a V-1 pulse jet with a radio-guided glide bomb. It never flew. The war was ending faster than they could design. Meanwhile, in the United States, the scientists who had worked on these weapons were already thinking beyond them. The success of rocket-assisted bombs convinced military planners that guided munitions could become standard. Research budgets soared. Laboratories that had once built experimental devices now began laying the foundations for long-range missiles and air-to-surface weapons. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Allied technical intelligence teams flooded into Peenemünde, Nordhausen, and other research centers. Among the blueprints and wreckage, they found notebooks filled with sketches of unfinished dreams, supersonic jets, orbital rockets, and atomic-tipped missiles. Yet, even among this treasure trove, what astonished the Germans most was what the Allies already possessed. During post-war interrogations, German engineers were shown footage of America's Bat and other guided bomb tests. They watched as small winged weapons detached from bombers, ignited, and struck ships squarely amidships. There was silence in the room. Dr. Walter Dornberger, one of the leading minds behind the V-2, later remarked, "In our arrogance, we believed we alone had mastered flight beyond control. Then we saw the American films. I realized we had been overtaken not by genius, but by industry." Those moments of realization, quiet, devastating, undeniable, marked the true turning point of technological warfare. The Germans had built rockets to inspire terror. The Americans had built rockets to ensure accuracy. One was about fear, the other about control. Both, however, pointed to the same destiny. A world where machines guided themselves, where human hands would one day no longer be needed to wage war. In those final months of World War II, the battlefield was no longer just earth and sky. It had become a proving ground for the future. Every explosion carried within it the echo of tomorrow, a signal that technology, not manpower, would decide the next wars. As Peenemünde burned under Allied bombs, and American engineers packed up their test data for post-war continuation, the balance of power shifted irreversibly. The German dream of domination through science had collapsed. But the torch of rocketry had been passed. And with it, the stunned silence of those who once believed they led the world in innovation, replaced by an uneasy admiration for those who had quietly surpassed them. The Americans had created rocket-assisted bombs. The Germans, for all their brilliance, could only watch as the future they once imagined took flight. Under another flag. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the silence that followed was not just political, it was scientific. Laboratories once roaring with invention now stood empty. Test stands, launch rails, and drafting tables lay abandoned in the wreckage of a collapsing Reich. The men who had dreamed of conquering the world through technology now found themselves prisoners of it. In that silence came discovery. Allied scientific intelligence teams, Operation Paperclip and its British counterpart, Operation Surgeon, swept through Germany collecting blueprints, prototypes, and people. They found the remains of the V-2 program, the jet fighter projects, and a library of technical drawings that mapped the German obsession with propulsion and flight. But among the captured files were also notes and reports that revealed something unexpected. Astonishment. Reports from Peenemünde and Nordhausen described German encounters with American rocket-assisted and radar-guided bombs. In the final months of the war, fragments of these weapons had been recovered and studied. The surviving records told the story plainly. The enemy has achieved autonomous control of airborne ordnance. For the engineers who had once believed Germany stood alone at the forefront of rocketry, the realization was shattering. In interrogations conducted by Allied officers in June 1945, several of von Braun's team admitted their disbelief. Dr. Walter Thiel's surviving assistants described the reaction when the first American glide bomb components were analyzed. "We were prepared to find crude copies of our designs," one recalled. "Instead, we found something efficient, simple, and ahead of its time." The documents retrieved from German archives after the war, technical memos, Engineering analyses and letters all carried the same tone. Disbelief. The Americans, they wrote, had mastered controllable descent by rocket propulsion. To them, that phrase represented a threshold, the line between a falling weapon and a flying one. The Allies, meanwhile, were discovering just how far their own programs had gone unnoticed. The U.S. Navy's BAT project, initially viewed as experimental, was now hailed as the world's first operational autonomous guided weapon. Its radar seeker, a small dish capable of tracking reflections from miles away, had been developed in secrecy at the National Bureau of Standards. The Germans had spent years perfecting the V-2's guidance gyroscopes. The Americans had quietly taught a bomb to think for itself. In Washington, military analysts understood the magnitude of what had happened. America had not just caught up with German rocketry, it had surpassed it in practicality. The war had proven that innovation did not belong to genius alone. It belonged to systems, to organization, to the ability to turn theory into production. When captured, German scientists were shown footage of the BAT in action. Their reactions bordered on reverence. "It is elegant," one said softly. "We made rockets that roared. They made bombs that listened." Those captured German minds would soon help shape the post-war world. Under Operation Paperclip, many of the Peenemünde engineers, including Werner von Braun, were relocated to the United States, where they would work on missile development and, eventually, the space program. There, in laboratories from Huntsville to Cape Canaveral, they encountered the next generation of American engineers, many of whom had cut their teeth on the wartime rocket-assisted bomb projects. The cross-pollination of those ideas changed everything. The lessons of BAT, Azon, and the early rocket-assisted designs became the seeds of the Cold War's missile revolution. From these primitive guided weapons would grow the air-to-surface missiles of Korea, the precision bombs of Vietnam, and eventually the satellite-guided munitions of the modern age. But in 1945, it was still a revelation. A quiet, almost philosophical one. The Germans had shown the world that power could be projected through the air without a pilot. The Americans had shown that it could be done with purpose. One side had built weapons of fear. The other had built weapons of control. Yet, the line between them was vanishing. In the months that followed the surrender, Allied intelligence analysts compiled a comparative report titled Relative Progress in Guided Weapons Development. It concluded, Germany pioneered in range and speed. The United States pioneered in control and precision. The future of warfare will depend on the synthesis of both. It was an astonishing admission, and it proved prophetic. For German scientists now living under American supervision, the discovery was bittersweet. They admired what the Americans had achieved, yet they could not escape the irony that their own advances had inspired it. "They learned from us," said Dornberger years later, "and then they surpassed us. That is the American way." Peenemünde, once a symbol of terror, became a footnote. The world's new centers of technological power lay across the Atlantic, in the laboratories and deserts of the United States. There, former enemies now worked side by side. Germans bringing their expertise in propulsion, Americans offering their mastery of mass production and electronics. The result would be the birth of the modern missile. But before that future unfolded, there was reflection, even humility. Allied investigators reading through German war diaries noted the tone of wonder in the technical correspondence. One German engineer wrote from a British internment camp, "They built weapons that did not need men. They made flight without pilots, thought without human eyes. I do not know if that is victory or something else." Entirely. It was a haunting thought that the very progress which had stunned them would soon reshape the human relationship with war itself. In the years that followed, the shock of those discoveries gave way to collaboration, and collaboration to competition. The Cold War's arms race would be the child of both Peenemünde and China Lake, born from terror and nurtured by ingenuity. Every missile launched in the decades ahead carried within it fragments of that wartime revelation, that machines could think, and that human ambition could make gravity itself an ally. To the German engineers who once stood speechless before the wreckage of America's rocket-assisted bombs, it was the end of an era and the beginning of something terrifyingly new. They had watched the future arrive. Not in theory, not on the drawing board, but in the burning aftermath of precision. The war had ended, but the machine had learned to fly on its own. When the fires of World War II finally dimmed, humanity found itself standing at the threshold of something vast and irreversible. The age of invention had crossed into the age of autonomy. What began as a desperate race between empires had ended as a revelation that the limits of man's reach were no longer measured in miles, but in imagination. The rocket-assisted bomb was more than a weapon. It was a message. Proof that the forces of gravity and motion could be bent to human will. In that moment, war had changed forever. No longer would the battlefield be confined to the range of a gun or the courage of a pilot. From now on, machines could think, correct, and destroy without a human touch. The German engineers, who had once believed themselves the masters of modernity, were forced to watch this transformation unfold under another flag. They had built rockets that touched the edge of space. The Americans had built bombs that touched precision itself. And in that precision lay both the genius and the danger of the future. It was no longer about who could build the largest weapon. It was about who could make it smartest. That single shift in philosophy reshaped the entire world. From the guided bombs of 1945 would grow the missiles that circled the globe, the satellites that watched the Earth, and the machines that could destroy it in silence. Yet, amid the triumph and the fear, there was something deeply human in it all. The unrelenting desire to understand, to push one step further, to master the forces that once mastered us. The same hands that forged destruction also reached for the stars. In the end, the German engineers were right to be stunned. They had witnessed not just a rival's invention, but the birth of a new species of warfare, one that would outlive them all. Somewhere in a forgotten hangar, beneath the dust of old blueprints and the silence of dismantled rockets, the future had already taken shape, small, precise, and unstoppable. And from that moment onward, the sky was no longer just a battlefield. It had become humanity's proving ground for destruction, for progress, and for destiny itself.